Hey, what's up guys? It's Matt with the Movement System. In this video, we're gonna cover 3 vertical jump training mistakes that you might be making and exactly how to fix them so you can start putting inches back on your vertical jump. We're gonna talk about the science in this video, but we're also gonna take you into a pro athlete's basketball training session in the off season where he's working on strength and vertical jump, so that way you guys can actually see what a pro basketball player is doing to train for vertical jump. Let's go ahead and dive into it. So shout out to Ben Adina, who I've had on the Movement System podcast before to talk about his training techniques, and for Kelvin and Chris for letting me film their session, so that way you guys can learn from and see the techniques that a knowledgeable trainer is using to work with these high-level athletes. All right, that leads us into mistake number 1, which is too much training volume. Too many people are doing their training sessions where they're kind of just throwing everything together. Any exercise they find on the internet that has to do with vertical jump, anything they can think of, they're just lumping it all together. A bunch of jumping exercises and plyos and conditioning all thrown together, but that's really not the best way to train. By contrast, this pro basketball player training session only had 8 exercises, and there was a good bit of rest between, especially the primary exercises. The training session started with some ladder work for coordination and activation and getting single leg stability and lateral movement, and then began to ramp up a bit and became more vertical with the pogo hops into a triple extension jump. After that, the primary loaded power and plyometric movements were really just 2 exercises, a loaded counter movement jump and a depth jump. The loaded counter movement jump was done for 5 reps with about 3 minutes of rest in between each set. And the depth jumps were relatively low reps as well. To finish the training session, there was about 15 minutes of conditioning work with significantly less rest between sets, involving lateral sled drags and some abdominal work. In total, I would say this training session was around 80 or so total vertical jumps. They were all strategic and intentional and very high power output. Specifically, in this case, Ben was measuring to make sure if he started a set of 5 vertical jumps at say 20 inches, they would end the set around maybe 18 inches, but they wouldn't go so far that they're fatigued and they're only jumping 12 or 16 inches or something like that. Too many people are making that mistake and they're adding too many sets, too many reps, and their vertical jump isn't anywhere near maximal when they're going for these repeated efforts, and it's not really going to translate to improving power. Now, of course, this is just one training session and one example. So how do you decide actually how much is the right volume for you? One really great guideline that was given by Ralph Mann, who was a really great Olympic athlete and then went on to get his PhD in biomechanics and teach a lot of really good information. He said that we really only want about 3 minutes of total high CNS stress activity in one training session. This means that those small brief moments where you're working at very high intensity for 5 or 8 seconds, for example, we want that to add up to less than 3 minutes of total work for the entire training session. That's how we actually get really high power and force output. That way we can actually make a meaningful improvement to that top end power and vertical jump. That leads us into mistake number 2, which is not enough rest between sets. If you're training plyometrics and strength in the same training session, you really want to put your plyometrics early in the training session. As we move through the training session, we have more and more central nervous system fatigue accumulating, which reduces the amount of voluntary activation of your muscle fibers. This means that your high threshold, fast twitch muscle fibers aren't firing at 100% by the time you get halfway through or 3/4 of the way through your workout. They're down to 90% and around 85% even after around 6 exercises or so. Plyometric exercises, again, require you to be near maximal for them to be effective. So if we're not doing them within the first 4, 5, or 6 exercises of the session, it's really not going to be that beneficial for you. That's why we generally want to stack our strength work, our hypertrophy work, and our conditioning work towards the end of the session and prioritize doing our plyometrics earlier in the session. For the training session that we keep referring back to, Kelvin and Chris were both working at about 3-minute rest intervals between sets of jumps. Ben was actually measuring with a contact mat how much their vertical jump had changed between sets. So if he knew, for example, at the very start of counter movement jumps that they were jumping around 20 to 21 inches, then at the start of each next set, they should be around that number again. And if they weren't, he probably wasn't programming enough rest. Because what makes you sweat and what makes you tired is not what's most effective for improving your vertical jump. If you have a way to measure, that's really great, like a contact plate or something like that. If not, you kind of want to eyeball it and give it your best shot. But as a good rule of thumb, you want to make sure that your athletes are not reducing their vertical jump by more than about 10% throughout the set. Some of you guys may have seen my CSCS prep specific videos and seen something like this work to rest ratio chart. This is directly from the NSCA, the National Strength and Conditioning Association, and it gives you a really good guideline on how much rest we should program between sets of work bouts. If, for example, we're working for a 10-second interval, that means that we should rest at least 12 to 20 times that much, so at least 120 seconds and up to around 200 seconds of rest. For conditioning work that we got into later in the training session, we don't need nearly as high of a work to rest ratio. We might be working for about a minute and then having about 3 minutes of rest, and even in that rest being active, doing something like abdominal work in between those sets. So that conditioning session can be more effective with shorter rests, whereas the plyometrics and power work really does need a lot of rest between sets. And if you guys are interested in learning more CSCS specific stuff, make sure you join my Facebook group, the Strength and Conditioning Study Group on Facebook, and check out my CSCS prep resources linked in the description below. The overall message on rest though is that we need to separate out our plyometric and power specific work from our conditioning work. If we wash and blend those together, that's kind of more like CrossFit style, and that's kind of okay if that's your goal, is to just be conditioned for that type of work, but it's not going to translate to best improving your vertical jump or sport specific movements for a sport like basketball or football. And that's why we don't see CrossFit athletes in the NFL or the NBA. And you're probably wondering, Matt, how do we know that there's not CrossFit athletes in the NFL or NBA? They would tell us. All right, and that leads us to mistake number 3, which is using too much or using too little weight for the exercise. We're gonna look at 2 different things to help us determine what the right amount of weight is for an exercise. One is the force velocity curve here, and the second one is this really great graph that I've used a couple times, which actually is from the Alabama football players and their power output at different percent of 1 rep max. If we're doing power specific exercises, we want to load appropriately to develop power and to push that up so that way we can get better adaptations there and a higher vertical jump. How do we do that? We can load our strength movements strategically, knowing that power output changes based on the percent 1 rep max that we're using. In this graph, you can see Alabama football players had their power output plotted against the percent 1 rep max that they were using. Really low on this graph, we can't get a lot of power output because there's just not enough load to push against. It's too fast. And very high on this graph, close to 100, 90, 80% 1 rep max even, it's gonna be too much weight where it's gonna be more forceful, but not that powerful. Somewhere in the middle here, around 65 to 70% 1 rep max, we get really good power output on a movement like a back squat. Now, this graph would actually change for different exercises. This is probably about how it would look for barbell movements like a bench press or a back squat. But for Olympic lifting movements or explosive movements like that, it actually may shift one way or another. Probably for Olympic lifting movements, we want to load closer to like 80% 1 rep max. If we're loading light, for example, at 20, 30, 40% 1 rep max, that really does have to be an explosive movement where we're actually leaving the ground or throwing something like a med ball throw or a dumbbell loaded vertical jump. In that case, you can actually explode through the end of the repetition and you can get peak power output with much lower loads. The force velocity curve is an inverse relationship between how much force we can produce in a movement. If we're moving really slow and powerfully, like a 1 rep max back squat, we would be really high on the force end of this force velocity curve. Whereas very fast movements with really short ground contact times, like sprinting for example, would be very much more biased towards the velocity end of things. The big principle to remember here though is that we want to load not so heavy that we're only training for force and not so light that we can't produce a lot of power. Overall though, I think there's some really good takeaways that we can think about in terms of how heavy we should be loading different movements. One thing we want to look for is too much joint excursion or form breakdown. In the case, for example, of these repeated counter movement jumps, if we put too much weight in these guys' hands, they're not going to be able to get very far off the ground and not going to be too powerful with this. This is actually closer to probably 20%, 30%, 40% body weight. Again, it depends on the athlete and how strong they are and how powerful they are and their experience with training. But if we're seeing too much joint excursion, that could actually really shortchange the stretch shortening cycle and make this exercise far less effective. We don't want the load to take them far beyond a typical jumping motion, or else the muscle spindles are going to be less effective and the overall movement isn't going to translate as much to improving their vertical jump. Taking a look back at the force velocity curve, we could load things just at body weight or even band assisted and work very close to the velocity end of this and really start to improve the neuromuscular adaptations that athletes have at body weight. This can be a good portion of a program for improving vertical jump, and we should probably include some exercises like that in the program. But we want to train along that force velocity curve closer to power, and even have some training all the way up towards maximal force as well. The balance in terms of how much you program towards the velocity end, how much we program in the middle towards power, and how much maximal force work we program really depends on the deficits of the athlete. If they're very bouncy but they're not very strong, then we might program more of the work towards the force end because that's where they have the deficit. If, for example, though, you or your athlete are really strong, you have a really good 1 rep max, but you're not that quick or not that fast, you might bias some of your training towards the power and velocity end of this because that's where you're deficient. And that type of programming would specifically address those limitations. So it's really tough for me to tell you without looking at your training, are you making the mistake of too much weight or too little weight in your training sessions? That really comes down to what your deficiency is, what you're training for, and making sure your program design matches your goals. Let me know in the comments below what you're training for and if any of these training mistakes have resonated with you or what's worked really well for your vertical jump in the past. Share that below so that everyone else can benefit from it. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Make sure you're following along on Instagram as well at The Movement System. If you want to learn more, you can check out the Movement System podcast as well, where I did an episode with Ben all about vertical jump training and basketball training. Shout out again to Kelvin and Chris for letting me film their training session. Thanks so much for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.